What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest, and these are my top decks to reach infinite with this week. Now, we're going to be doing something a little bit different this week. Instead of just talking about each list, what we're going to be doing is showing how you can customize each list to the metagame. So let's get started with this classic Iron Patriot list. This is the list I play on ladder right now, so it's just sort of a default list that I consider to be good versus most things that I'm going to run into. A couple specific flex slots here, though, are Iron Man, Luke Cage, and Wave. Luke Cage is for high evolutionary decks that rely on things like Cyclops. Wave is for Kitty Pryde lists, and Iron Man is in the list. I think he's a bit of a flex spot, but he's very good in the matchup against the high evolutionary Lockjaw deck, which just goes very tall. In the Lockjaw lane, you can win that lane with an Iron Man and really put the pressure on them, so that's definitely something to consider. Now, let's take a look at an alternate build of this list that is built to combat some different things. Now, this build is built to beat the Control high evolutionary decks with Spider-Man. Those decks are very reliant on their one-cost cards, so with Invisible Woman and Killmonger, we can make sure that those cards go away forever. Killmonger is a very useful card right now. Invisible Woman Killmonger even helps us beat Kitty Pryde, so this is kind of a two birds, one stone here. We have the Killmonger for the decks that are reliant on Misty Knight, Sunspot, and Nebula. And of course, we have Invisible Woman Killmonger if we need to hit a Kitty Pryde. That gives us priority on the final turn of the game. So I hope this sort of illustrates what today's tier list is going to be like. We're going to be talking about a default build of a list, and then we're going to be talking about how you can customize that list for your own metagame and what you can do to understand the cards as they have a role in each list and what cards are replaceable, what cards are not. So I hope that you not only learn to fish from this, but also you get some fish from this. It's not just, teach a man to fish and you'll never fish another day in his life. I don't know the proverb, but the point is I'm giving you deck lists, but I'm also showing you how to make them your own. Proverbs don't matter. So here's a great example of a base deck list that has a very defined weakness. This list, I call it the pink print. It's just a Kitty Pryde deck. It has two incredibly obvious weaknesses. The first is Wave, Sandman, cards that restrict you from playing a lot of cards on the final turn of the game. The second is the other way of restricting you from playing a lot of cards on the final turn of the game, Spider-Man and Storm. So, since those are common, you can take a look at combating at least one of them by changing a couple cards in the deck. This is an example of a version of the deck that is very similar to Equinox's build, but with less respect paid to Patriot, so no Super Skrull, and more respect paid to the high evolutionary Lockjaw build. So what we have is a Shang-Chi in the... This is an example of how you could tech this build against an expected metagame. Now, I already think Kitty Pryde decks are pretty good into the high evolutionary Lockjaw decks, but Shang-Chi and Iron Man really take that to the next level. Invisible Woman helps protect your Iron Man from Enchantresses if you run into any of those, and also lets you put your Kitty Pryde down there so she doesn't come back if you're expecting a wave. You can also put your Hit Monkey in there to sort of bank it for later in the game if that is something you are interested in doing. It is not something that comes up a ton, but it is something you can do, and you should also note that all the cards under Invisible Woman count for Hit Monkey as long as it is under there, so you should be able to get some real value out of that if that is the goal. So you can keep those kind of counterplays in mind for wave decks. You don't have to explode on turn 6 as much, and of course, if you get waved, you have Iron Man, you have America Chavez, you might actually be ahead on board, and you might be able to take the game home. Now, one thing this list is not prepared to beat is Spider-Man stuff. That's just tough. It just is. So you are going to run into that. And if they start doing Spider-Man stuff, you end up having to understand what your retreat triggers are pretty quick. And you do need to respect their snaps in that matchup. One other thing I should note, though, is that with new move cards coming out, I don't expect Spider-Man decks to have good matchups against everything anymore. And that move deck might end up changing the meta in such a way that this deck comes back in a big way. It is already a force to be reckoned with if people are not respecting it, and if they're not respecting it, you're going to run them over. This is the baseline build of the High Evolutionary Control list, and it's what I consider to be one of the two boogeymen of this format. Spoiler alert, the other one is also a High Evolutionary deck. So this list relies on playing off-curve using powerful units to scam lanes. So Storm and Professor X, when I say scam, that is what I refer to. Use Storm and Professor X to scam a lane, and then, you know, maybe you win another lane with the other scam card, or maybe you win another lane with the gigantic Hulk. You basically have two modes here. One is scam one lane, win the other with a Hulk. The other is scam one lane, then scam the other lane. Both of them are totally viable ways to play. One of the things that is underrated about this deck is just the amount of power it puts out. It's not like it's overpowering, but you definitely put out enough power to reasonably threaten 3 locations, even in the games where you aren't turbo scamming. Like, normally you need at least a Spider-Man or a Storm to be in these games, but you can really get a lot of power on the board with just your 1-cost cards and soaking enough, and that is a real upside of this build, which is very low to the ground, so you can always play off curve, so your Hulk is always large, and you get maximum benefit from passing the turn with mana floating in the form of Misty Knight and Cyclops. An example of a different build of this list would be with High Evolutionary and Iron Lad. So Iron Lad adds a ton of beef to the deck. Obviously, Iron Lad hitting a lot of cards is very powerful. Jeff, Doctor Doom, Cyclops, Spider-Man. There's a bunch of good hits in here, to say nothing of hitting the Hulk. Now, there are some bad hits, though. Like, Sunspot's not going to do a ton, Nebula's not going to do a ton, Wasp is pretty medium, High Evolutionary itself actually sucks. So it's a bit of some trade-offs here. Also, you are a little bit worse at floating energy when you play this list because you have so many more big guys in it. You know, the difference between this list and the last list is we cut out some things from the early part of the game and we added in a 4-cost card and a 5-cost card in the form of Iron Lad and Professor X. So there's a lot more beef in here, but there's also a lot less turn skipping and a lot less benefit from it. As you see, we have no Misty Knight in it. So one thing this deck does well is sort of make it very clear when the game has been won. I also think it has a little bit more just raw power to it, but which one is going to be your preference will depend on how you like to play the deck. And that's one of the other things I really wanted to get across here, is that you don't have to just customize the deck to the meta. You can customize the deck to what you enjoy. I like the one with 3 1-drops more, but it does mean that I'm a lot more vulnerable to Killmonger if I play it, and that is something that I have to know going in and be willing to accept. So keep that in mind. I've even seen builds of this with no 1-drops at all, just relying entirely on the top-end Storm and Spider-Man to win this, and that is a unique way to approach the matchup, because if you run no 1-drops at all, I mean, you can run your own Killmonger, and that's a really interesting thing to do. This is what I consider the default build of Killmonger Lockjaw, which is the other boogeyman of this format. It is an extremely powerful deck that can high roll incredibly hard, and it's actually quite difficult to counter their strategy. Generally speaking, you know, my first thought was, okay, I'll play a bunch of rock decks, but it only really works if you go Zabu into Rock Slide, and even then, they can still high roll out of it. So it is definitely a strong deck. Passing early isn't as big of a deal when you have Killmonger to clean up the things your opponent does on those turns, and you're banking power on the Hulk, and because of Lockjaw, you're more likely to see the Hulk in any game than basically any other deck in the entire game of Marvel Snap, and that's a really powerful thing. The Hulk is often 20 power in this build, and I will say, though, you do have a little bit of a weakness to the opposing builds of this deck that still run cards like the Infinite. Obviously, we are not doing that. This deck has been going along a similar evolution as the original Thanos Lockjaw lists, where they started to realize, like, okay, if we didn't play the Infinite and stuff like that in here, we'd actually be able to win the games where we don't draw Lockjaw. And that's what this deck is built to do a little bit more than some of the other builds of it. So it is, once again, a trade-off here, but Killmonger, a worthy addition here. And I wanted to highlight something that I saw in a tournament. I believe it was credited to Lambie series, so let's get that on screen. This is like kind of a tournament-only tech, but I wanted to highlight it because even a deck like Lockjaw, which only has 1 real available tech slot, has ways of customization here. So when you look at this, you have the same list, but instead of Killmonger, we're running Iceman. Why are we running Iceman? Because in the mirror, hitting your opponent's Lockjaw is an unbelievably big deal, and you're probably going to hit your opponent's Lockjaw with an Iceman if you're playing a mirror, because they don't really have other cards you can hit. You're either hitting Lockjaw, you're hitting Wasp, you're hitting Jane, or you're hitting Thor. Maybe sometimes you're hitting a Mjolnir in there. Like, you are hitting something good, unless, of course, you hit High Evolutionary, in which case it's not that good. Even hitting Jubilee is very good, but High Evolutionary actually soaking these Iceman is a legitimate thing that does happen. I had a High Evolutionary get up to 6 cost the other day, and I was like, that is the best that he has ever been, soaking those Iceman procs. What a hero. So keep in mind that even in these decks that don't look like there's a ton of customization available, there's still a lot of thought that you need to put into how you want to build them. Next up is perhaps the mascot for the most customizable decks. It's Thanos. It's still good. I do think it's like a little bit one of those like tier 1.5-ish decks where it's very good if you are good at managing it, but I don't think it has the raw power of everything else. The appeal of Thanos is that you can customize it to fit whatever metagame you are attempting to combat, and it will always be able to do a pretty good job of that, but you have to stay on top of it, and it won't always necessarily be the most efficient way of doing that. I did want to highlight this list because it is still just sort of my default Thanos list. If I want to just play some Thanos, this is where I go. But as a way of illustrating the nearly infinite customizability of this deck, I mean, look at this. You can pretty much do anything. Here we are playing Galactus and Thanos. I don't know. It's fine. This has been a remarkably successful list for me, to the point that I actually did a video on it, and it's in here partially because it's good, but also partially because I want to demonstrate just how different a deck can be while still mostly being the same archetype. This is still a Thanos list. It still relies on many of the same interactions. You know, you still draw Mind Stone early and it's really good, but it's a very different deck. It's not a Lockjaw deck, it's more of a control deck, and you have this Galactus finisher juke surprise in here as well that you can pull off. It's definitely worth talking about, worth considering, and you should, as always, respect Galactus. Here's an example of just what I consider the default Galactus list. And even this, there's, you know, some things to quibble about here, but you're trying to do an early Galactus using either Electro or Wave. If you do Electro, you want to do Doc Ock to get their answers to Galactus out of their hand. Then you play Galactus, then you play a big null. Very straightforward. This is the default Galactus list. It's still very powerful if it's unchecked. And right now, it's unchecked by a ton of stuff. Notably, the Patriot list runs Debris, and of course, the High Evolutionary Lockdown list does have answers to you in the form of just Spider-Manning you when you Galactus on 4, things like that, because they're probably going to be ahead of you. Generally speaking, though, Kitty Pryde loses to this. The Thanos decks can lose to this pretty comfortably. The Lockjaw High Evolutionary list has absolutely nothing for a Galactus, and you will just beat it for free. And this is a sort of ever-present threat that exists in the metagame. Frankly, I kind of wonder what's going to happen when Ghost Spider comes out and everyone starts playing Move, and that deck is so dead to Galactus. Like, not just normal dead to Galactus, but you play your own cloak that helps Galactus dead to Galactus. Like, way more dead to Galactus than a normal deck. It's tough. So you definitely have to keep this deck in mind when you build stuff. And I think that's actually kind of the best argument for why Galactus should not be in his current format, which is, you just always have to respect this, and that demands like 1 or 2 slots in every deck you build. And that really sort of constrains what decks can be good in a kind of not very fun way. So Galactus, respect it, know it, or just accept that you're going to lose a cube every so often. Finally, I wanted to highlight just a non-gimmicky High Evolutionary list. And this list, I think, is uniquely well positioned into a bunch of different stuff right now. It's kind of mopey, but it gets to run the tech cards, so it has good answers to things. You know, Shang-Chi and Enchantress, very, very powerful. Shang-Chi, very good against the Lockjaw list, especially if you're outputting power early, and this deck does have the ability to surprise you with the amount of power it can output. Of course, you're also running the Hulk. And one interesting thing I've noticed about the dynamic playing the Spider-Man Storm High Evolutionary lists is that it, against other High Evolutionary lists, is that not running Spider-Man and Storm almost makes them better in the mirror match, or the pseudo mirror here. And I do wonder about that dynamic. I'm not 100% sure about it, but I definitely haven't felt favored playing the control list into lists like this. And I'm not sure if that's just my experience or lack thereof with how these lists actually work, but they're just powerful. They just do strong stuff. And I think this shell is a little bit underexplored and needs to be examined and respected as a reasonable deck going forward. Another example of this is a list that I call pre-Doomwave. So the basic premise here is you pass on turn 4, and then you play a She-Hulk and a Wave. You know how you used to do, Wave on 5 into She-Hulk plus something? This is doing that in advance. I think it's a very, very fun little way for High Evolutionary to work, and certainly it's a unique way to build the deck. You soak all your energy, and then you end up getting benefits from soaking it from Misty Knight and Cyclops. You also get, Sunspot, you get your She-Hulk cheaper. I think it's very cute. I really enjoy this as a wave deck. I do wonder, I don't think it has the ability to go toe-to-toe with, say, the Patriot list, but even I think the Lockjaw list, if they get a good roll, will kind of ruin you a little bit, maybe. But even then, Wave is actually decent in those matchups because they tend to be 6-drop plus Wasp or 6-drop plus Mjolnir on the final turn, and lowering the high roll potential of them is genuinely pretty good because that 6-drop goes in a Lockjaw lane really sucks for you. Or lowering that high roll potential, generally pretty good. Because if that 0-cost card goes in a Lockjaw lane, that's usually another 6-drop, and you kind of actually do get some value out of Wave here. So keep this kind of deck in mind in terms of an archetype that could emerge in the future, and one that I think even right now is just sort of generally pretty damn strong, unless you're doing something that severely goes over the top of it. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that version of the tier list. So it ends up being like 7 decks, but it's actually like 13 or 14. I just wanted to show you how to customize all these decks, how to make them yours, how to take something that I give you and just run with it. So I'm hoping that that is something that you really enjoyed. Obviously, I enjoyed making it. As always, I've been KMBest. I will see you in the next one. Remember, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you liked this format. I enjoyed making it, but I can get back to like doing, the 10-minute video where I just go over all the lists. If that's something what people want to see, I don't mind. I just wanted to see if I could teach y'all to fish, so to speak. I'll see you next time.